All right, so finishing up the rest of the respectful workplace policies. So under our policy, and I'm hoping that you've taken the time to read our policies, there's two processes for reporting. And one is an informal procedure and the other is a formal procedure. And I don't think, oh yes I do, I have the clicker down here. Oh. Okay, so this isn't really centered all that great. Oh, it's up there, looks really good. Okay, I'll forget my monitor down in front of me because it doesn't look at all like that up there. So the informal procedure is in relation to behavior that you try to address right on the ground when it happens. So if, as a leader, for example, you have a branch Facebook page and then someone is on the page and they're making a discriminatory comment or their comments are bullying, it's important for you to immediately speak to that person and follow the informal procedure. So addressing issues at the lowest common denominator, at the lowest common level, is really, really important. So you would point out the inappropriate behavior that under our policy, that this behavior is inappropriate, and you would ask the individual to stop that behavior. And I know that branch volunteers or branch presidents are doing that at your branch meetings already, that you're pointing out, reminding people to be respectful and keeping it at the lowest common denominator. So you make every effort to resolve the issue as quickly as possible. But what about that doesn't work? What about the behavior continues? You speak to them and say, okay, this behavior is not appropriate. Please refrain from doing that. We want to be very inclusive. So then you need to elevate the issue. It can still remain informal process, but you might want to bring it to the attention of another person, and whether that be at a provincial event. So say if we were at convention and a coffee break, you felt that someone was speaking inappropriately towards you and you tried to resolve that issue with the person, but the behavior continued, then you need to bring it to someone at a higher level and ask that person to intervene. And at a conventional level, it would be the individuals that we've identified as our healthy workplace representatives on the convention floor. And then that person then would intervene in a very informal way and say, this has been brought to my attention, we have a policy, I'm going to ask that you refrain from that behavior again. So sometimes you'll notice in the policy the person it's brought to could be the RNU president or their designate. It depends on the situation and the event that is ongoing, who those people might be. So informal, it's trying to resolve at the lowest possible level, and informally as possible. So then we get to a more formal procedure, and under legislation, there is a requirement to have an informal and then a formal mechanism. And this is for complaints that aren't resolved at the informal level, so you raise it to someone else and they speak to the person, but the behavior still continues, or the issues are serious enough that it warrants a formal complaint. And formal complaints are in writing. And this is very similar to your employer's workplace policies as well. So I know a lot of you are familiar with this type of process. So if you can't resolve it at the informal level or it's a serious issue, then you should make an official complaint in writing, and it should go to the RNU president or the designate for the RNU president, and then it will be handled from there. What to include in terms of a formal complaint would include things such as time, date, description of what happened, whether there were any witnesses, and if any actions have been taken to deter the behavior from happening again. I'm just trying to turn my page here. So once we receive then a formal complaint, and we hope that we never ever receive one, right? Like the objective is to address things informally if you can, and resolve issues at the informal level. But if that can't happen, then you need a formal procedure. So after a formal complaint is received, and then there is an investigation done. Now it's up to the discretion, if the behavior is outside of the harassment prevention plan, then there will be no investigation. Or if, say, for example, something comes to me and I say, look, we should be able to get the parties together and discuss this and resolve this rather than having a real formal investigation. So there is some latitude for the president to look at the issue to see, can we really try to resolve this in another way? But if warranted, then there is an investigation, and this will involve, and no different than if this was happening in your workplaces, interviews with the accuser, interviews with the accused, and any witnesses that might have been party to the event. Huge point in our policy is around confidentiality. So anyone involved in a complaint, including witnesses, are not to disclose any details pertaining to the complaint or the facts of the complaint except to management or people who are investigating. And parties involved can't go around and discuss the issues with anybody that will listen. Everyone has to respect the process in order for it to work, so confidentiality is key. We have to remind people if they're putting in a complaint that they have to keep it confidential. They're not allowed to go around and talk to all their coworkers about it. They have to keep it to themselves. Our policy says that resolution will normally be completed within 30 days of receiving the complaint, or upon the decision to proceed with a formal investigation. Now, sometimes it can take longer than that, and that, of course, just depends on the circumstances. And we find that in the healthcare workplaces as well, and complaints that we've been involved in. Depends on when the employer can do interviews and things like that to finish the investigation. And the priority is to do the investigation right. It's not to get it done fast. You want to get it done quickly because people are obviously quite stressed about any complaint, but you want to make sure that it's done correctly. So that's our process. And we have a rollout plan in terms of our policy. Our policy was drafted for the board by an external consultant, and she looked at a risk assessment for us and developed a plan to meet our unique needs, and then it went to the board of directors for discussion and input. We also circulated it to our staff so they could have discussion and input as well. Our staff and the board have received training on our plan. The policy is available and accessible on my RNU. We're working on an education plan to broaden it out to our members, and it will probably be some online education. One of the key things, though, in terms of the legislation, is that it can't just be like a 5-minute education on our plan and say, okay, we got a policy, you can make complaints, either formal and informal, and go read the policy so you know what it's all about. That is not an education plan under the legislation. And if government came in and asked to see our plan and asked to see our education plan that goes with it, and we said, this is what we're doing, they would say, you are not meeting the legislation. By education, they mean education. This is so important to workplaces, and this all stems, of course, from some incidents that happened in other workplaces, which were very, very public. So we have to have a very good process around this. So we're looking at things like webinars for our volunteers. The policy will be added to our shop steward education sessions, as well as our branch executive training sessions, and an opening acknowledgement at all of our events around our policy will be done. And we will be, making sure that we're doing education with our members, because this is obviously really important. As well, and I mentioned this yesterday, that this doesn't just apply to face-to-face interactions, it also applies to online formats, such as, our convention discussion forum that we had going today. It also applies to our discussion forum on My RNU. And we have updated our app. And by the way, if you had the app, you do need to delete your old app and download the new one. After that, though, the update should happen regularly. So we have added new guidelines to the My RNU form. And if you go in there right at the top, it's a recognition of our respectful workplace policy. There's a link for you to go to read the policy. And we want to make sure our form is very welcoming for our members. It's a place to access advice and share information. And we will be monitoring the form and making sure that people are keeping their comments to the issues and being respectful. If they're disagreeing with each other, that it has to be done with respect. Everybody doesn't have to agree, but you have to be respectful of one another when you're making a comment. And if branches need some help from us, if they have Facebook pages for your branch or whatever, and you would like to develop some guidelines around respect as well, we can certainly help you with that. So some key takeaways from our policy. First of all, our policy applies to all RNU events. Business, social, all events. If anything is done under the RNU banner, the policy applies. Everyone has a right to a healthy working environment. Everyone is responsible for their own words and actions. And leaders have an additional obligation to ensure the health and safety of workers and members. So we're held to a higher level. And that's an important thing to remember as leaders. Another key takeaway is ought to know is important. If you ought to have known that this behavior was probably going to offend someone, then that's not an excuse to get away with the behavior. I didn't know. Well, you ought to have known, because this behavior is unacceptable behavior in the public domain. So ought to know is really important. Focus on prevention and not reaction. So our heavy work on our policy should be on educating people around, the front end of the policy. That's where our focus needs to be, rather than the processes we have in place for the complaint. It's great we got processes, but obviously we want to have respectful workplaces so that we don't have complaints. And if something starts, that we need to address it really quickly so it doesn't snowball and continue. Allegations of violations are always taken seriously. Always taken seriously. And every effort should be made to resolve the complaint as quickly as possible. So our full respectful workplace policy and harassment prevention plan is found in our policy manual and My RNU, and it was attached to the resolutions for the convention. And obviously, if you have any questions on the policy, please don't hesitate to reach out to your board representative or myself or Yvette, and we can certainly review with you.